Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 621, Big Google Energy. For Monday, January 25th, 2021. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norton. Thanks for joining us. Google has been embroiled in litigation internationally for some time over proposals to pay publishers for use of content in search results. Now Google is threatening to turn off search in Australia over the issue. Is it a wise move? Tonight we'll discuss. Also, whether the push for moderation is becoming censorship, a look at the podcast advertising model, the problem with agency culture, plus this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the executive producer and host of Corona TV, author, speaker, Mr. Joseph Jaffe. Hi, Joe.
Wait, executive producer, I got a promotion. Woohoo!
Yeah, I know. I throw that in for myself every once in a while. It makes me sound a lot more important than I actually am. Now, also joining us, Associate Vice President of Marketing Strategy at Arizona State University, author, speaker, Mr. Adam Pierno. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Bob. How are you? Great to be back.
Great to have you here. Now, next, we have the founder of The Red Thread, independent consultant and keynote speaker, Ms. Tamsen Webster. Hello, Tamsen.
Hello, Bob. I'm back on the BeanCast. Yay!
I love when you guys come on. And speaking of one Webster, we have the other Webster as well. We welcome back the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Strategy at Edison Research, noted podcasting expert, Mr. Tom Webster. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Bob. I would follow my wife anywhere.
Apparently you have. Well, glad to have you all on the program this week. It's not an easy set of topics. I apologize for that, but it's kind of a good conversation to be having right now. First up on the agenda, Google made headlines this week for threatening to block Australian access to search functionality over a new Australian law that requires the search giant to pay publishers for use of article snippets in search results. Now, this comes only a few weeks after they were forced by EU courts to make similar payments to publishers there. Tamsen, is this Australia threat by Google a tactical mistake on their part, or could it be more effective than the press is giving them credit for? What do you think?
I don't think this is a good move for Google, frankly. Also, hat tip to Australia Day, which is Tuesday, so well-timed article, Bob. Nice. I'm impressed.
It all comes together somewhere in my head.
Yeah. It must have been. I mean, the thing is, so do I know a lot about these kinds of things? No, I don't. Does that limit my opinion?
Amen. Amen.
No,
Amen.
Absolutely not. I mean, so I was thinking about this and I was really trying to figure out, okay, well, what do I understand about this? And what I do understand about this is reputationally what this kind of approach can do, and how do people respond to kind of threats and ultimatums like this? And the quick answer is not well. And so there's a couple things going on here. One is that Google, it really isn't reputationally in the best position right now. I mean, they're under a huge amount of fire here in the US. I mean, they had just made a similar arrangement to what Australia is asking in France. And so I kind of think like walking in with their BGE, their kind of big Google energy here is probably not the right choice.
Big Google energy. That's great.
Because the thing is, like, when you tell someone they have to do something, I mean, it's a fundamental human reaction to go no, because it feels like you're stripping somebody of their control or their freedom. And they just react poorly to that. Australians in particular, I'm going to take a bet.
Let's think about that. Why did they pick a fight with Australia? I mean, you bring up that point, which is really important, that the EU just did something with them. They just lost this case in France. Why do they think they're going to get away with it in Australia?
I have no idea, other than the fact that I think that Google and potentially some of the other big tech companies are really, I think, under the delusion that they have an equal power to a company, to a country, but a company doesn't equal a country. And when a company gets to a point of power where they feel like they can wield that amount of power, well, you can take kind of reputation and reaction right up the line, because it's going to turn very quickly into regulation. And the thing is, it's kind of the classic saw of working in a company, that no one is irreplaceable. I think the same thing is true of a company. I mean, there's other ways for people to get access to their news. There's other search engines. And so a lot of this, just really, honestly, it really does come back to me to the kind of like big Google energy. Like, I don't think that that's going to work, because there's a lot of other alternatives. I mean, the problem with making an ultimatum is that you have to be perfectly satisfied with either answer. And I don't think Google would be satisfied with both options that they've presented.
Yeah, I don't understand why they made this move. Joe, this seems like desperation to me. I mean, it seems like it's a huge desperate play on their part. It's not too dissimilar from some of the things that they said in France. It's not too dissimilar from some of the things they've been saying all around the world about, well, we're going to have to shut down some of your access, or we're going to have to limit, whether articles are shared, in your country. And they always lose this argument. Why are they going all out and saying we're just going to shut off search in Australia? Is Australia just such a small market for them that they can afford it? Is this a legitimate threat on their part?
I mean, there's so much to so much you said there that I don't know what to get to first. I mean, first of all, Australia, maybe it's a large mass of land with a small amount of people, but this is a country that's got its act together, and with very intelligent people. People who know how to use the internet, by the way, and social media, and some very smart people have come out of Australia. So that's definitely not the small country that you want to pick a fight with. I will say, going back to, I loved what Tamsen said, which is you've got to be able to live with both outcomes. And I feel like this might just be what's called in poker and gambling terminology a bad bluff. But what it comes down to, desperation, maybe, but this really is the thesis of let's see how big we get before we suck, before we go bad. I mean, we've seen Facebook going through tremendous challenges. We're seeing Amazon going through it, or at least there will be when the current administration starts rocking and rolling. And these companies, I think Tamsen actually said it. She said a company isn't a country. But actually, that's not true, because some of these companies are bigger than countries in terms of their revenue versus the GDP of some pretty large countries, probably Australia included. And the fact is, these companies are just too big. They're too big, and the only way that they can continue to grow is through acquisition and maybe some unfair labor practices or competitive practices. It's tough. I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying this is the result of a continued explosion of choice, lowering barriers to entry for new entrants, and also just in terms of the way the world is changing. And so desperation, maybe a little bit. All it takes is a little bit of blood for those piranhas to come.
Well, I think that's a really important point, Joe. I mean, yes, from a GDP standpoint and from a money standpoint, these companies are getting to the size of countries, but countries have a whole host of weapons, both literal and metaphorical, in their pocket that a company does not. And that seems to be the thing where they're like super delusional, and this is getting in their way, because it's like, if you're going to act like that and kind of come in with the bravado and braggadocio of a country, like, you are going to invite the kind of response that a country would give another country Or and worse, actually, the kind of response that a country is going to give to a company, which is you don't have to operate here, and we can make it very, very difficult for you to be profitable.
Let's play down this rabbit hole for a second, because it's just like we've brought up on the show before the concept of the metanational. You have multinational corporations. Metanational is the next stage for company evolution. Suddenly, this corporate entity has the power of a government and is providing healthcare and services to its employees like you would citizens. And then they start competing with the actual governments. In a lot of ways, Google could shut down the internet. I mean, they could just shut it down. They've got the hackers. They know how to do it. I mean, they're as dangerous as North Korea when it comes down to it, whether or not they could. So they have weapons. Is this just the beginning of big companies flexing their muscles and going, we've had it with these regulations that we don't agree with, we're going to take a stand? Do you think that's in the near future, or is that something that's completely out of the water?
I have no possible way of knowing that answer.
Well, I mean, I don't expect that you'd know it.
At the same time, the thing is like, yes, I understand that argument philosophically, but these companies are run by citizens of countries, which means they are still subject to those laws, and they're still subject to what those, what can happen there. So yeah, they can shut down the entire internet, and then the people who run them are going to suffer the consequences. At least ideally, that's how it works. I mean, this is where I'm going back to my point about the size of these companies, is that they get to that point and countries start to see them as a threat, then these countries are going to take steps to make sure that doesn't happen. At least let's hope so. But, I don't know. Maybe we're all just devolving into the singularity anyway, and I give up. Oh, never mind.
Before I was an international jet-setting and yet home-based market researcher.
I hear you're a home-based working expert.
I am a home-based working expert. Thank you. I'm a home-based keynote speaker. I was a student of literature, and there's this concept in literature called the pathetic fallacy, where you assign human feelings and responses to animals and inanimate objects. It's why we name things like weeping willows when the tree itself is not crying. And that's the exact same sort of thing you're doing when you talk about Google flexing its muscles. Because I think it's entirely possible, and I don't know who else on this call has worked with Google, but it's entirely possible that the people who made this decision in Australia don't even know that the people who made that decision for the EU even exist or talk to each other. It is a giant company that is not necessarily always making consistent decisions. Unlike an extremely kind of hierarchical government system like you have in Australia, Google doesn't necessarily make the same consistent decisions from country to country, and I don't even think internally they necessarily keep track of all that. And to prove that, I put out on some of my favorite social networks, I put out a request for people to tell me what they thought about this specific issue. So I put a post on Google+, I put one on Google Wave, I put one on Google Buzz, Google Answers, Orkut, Jaiku, and I got nothing.
I'm surprised that you didn't get more response from all those dead social networks.
I got nothing. And so I don't know, maybe that's censorship, and I know we'll talk about that later. But all of that is to say that, Google makes a lot of mistakes. I just named 6. And this might just be another one, right? That and maybe there's nothing more to it than that.
Which is reasonable to say. And I love that you brought that up, that people do tend to anthropomorphize, the companies that they deal with as actual people. And you're right. They don't have consistency across the board because they are run by different operating units in different countries, et cetera. And there's all kinds of different perspectives that come into play. So yeah, of course it's not going to be unified in the voice. And it's good to remember that. Adam, let's take this from the other side of this equation. I mean, the big fight is over publishers wanting some kind of recompense for Google serving up snippets of articles from their publications in search results. Do you really believe that the publishers are, first of all, being wronged, and second of all, that if they get the money, it's going to be nearly enough to compensate them for all the times that the people don't click through to the article and see it on their site? I mean, is the revenue really going to be enough to offset the losses of this in the first place?
Well, I do not think you are going to get back to making those publishers whole. If you go back to the 90s when Google started and the whole information wants to be free argument was won and lost at this simultaneously, it seems, in Google's favor. That revenue that has been captured over time and gone to Google will never make its way back to the publishers. And those publishers, I don't think, will make enough to suddenly become these flourishing businesses that we need. Again, however, something is better than nothing. So I see this is the place for Google to dig in and make a stand here, because once payments start going from Google to a recipient, it would start with publishers, but who would be next? Anybody else they've pulled this same tactic with. So that's online travel, that's weather, anywhere that you get an instant answer.
But am I wrong about this? Am I wrong about the fact that they're already they're paying the publishers in France, they're paying I think there's an agreement in the US to do something similar. I mean, or at least on the table. I mean, it's not, I know that they're not being consistent, like Tom says, but how do they expect to get away with this argument that somehow if we pay you, Australia, everybody else is going to want money when everybody else is already on the road to getting money?
Well, what I was wondering, Tamsen made a great point about having an approach where the country is having a showdown with Google, And what I was wondering is if the EU and France specifically has a very strong relationship between government and the media and even control of communication throughout their country. And I wonder if they chose Australia. Now, Tom, you could be right. This could be just a totally one-off group that made a decision. But I wonder if they chose Australia as a first step to an approach that they would take with the UK and the US, and Australia being the smallest of those three, where journalism is really bad, is in a really bad way in those three places, and government's connection to it is very loose at the moment. Maybe they're choosing Australia to have that first round of battles before they have to go to places where it'll be more challenging.
What do you think, Tom? I mean, it's just like, I think the question was directed your way. Is this just the first round in a longer foray?
I think it's going to be whack-a-mole for many, many years about this. And Google is sort of a strange company, or not strange as an odd, but I'd say they stand out in that they operate everywhere, and not every internet-based company actually does operate everywhere, right? And I think of companies like Pandora, where the local restrictions on licensing music are so diverse and so unrelated from country to country that they just went, I don't know. And so I don't know if this is necessarily a test case, sort of a toe in the water. Well, we'll see. But I mean, I know we're going to get to a sort of a second, somewhat related topic on this, but I think you're going to continue to see the big five tech giants here continue to poke at the edges, because in other parts of their business, they are going to be experiencing some pressures.
And with that note, you gave me a perfect segue into the next topic. Look, with all the self-righteous focus on whether big tech should offer better content moderation, which is another big factor in a lot of the ill will toward the big tech giants, there's a lot of pressure on them to offer better content moderation to avoid the spread of misinformation. In that process, it often gets overlooked that this push for fact-based reporting is also leading to an outright push for censorship throughout the many smaller publishing platforms that are out there. Just to run through a few of them, there was the forcing out of Barry Weiss at the New York Times. There was the call to remove Andrew Sullivan's newsletter from Substack. Spotify wrestling with how to deal with the outcries over Joe Rogan's content. I mean, the dark side of demanding moderation is leading to a squashing of all contrary opinion out there. And the number one way this usually happens is through pushing for advertiser boycotts, putting our industry right in the middle of all this. So, Adam, obviously advertisers should be handling each situation differently. But often the response is to simply turn off the ad dollars until the crisis is over. And my question to you is this a wise move? Is this something that is sustainable? I mean, obviously it's effective for the people who are advocating for this, but is it something that advertisers should even contemplate? And should we be resisting the threats to our bottom line by boycotting every content that is contrary to everything that we hold dear? I mean, I'm not really sure how to phrase that, but
yeah. But and even where does we? Who do you consider part of the we that you just used? It makes it even more challenging.
Well, exactly. And what I'm wondering is just like, is it wise for us to be a part of this? Is it wise for us to participate in boycotts? Should we be resisting this more?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this, you can swing back and forth with the pendulum as you consider each potential outcome, because it is a slippery slope. And all of a sudden you can, what starts out feeling very, yay, we're doing the right thing, can suddenly start to feel very dark when, don't give someone a power you wouldn't want them to use against you, I think is the adage that I would reference. But I was watching NFL football today, and I was thinking about the audience for those games. And let's say it's 18 to 34-year-old men is your prime audience there. And I would say that compares pretty closely to the audience that goes to Pornhub. Now, the ads I saw
Wow.
all day. Well, listen though, the ads I saw all day targeting that group of people on the NFL. I did some research for this show, and you didn't see any of those advertisers on Pornhub. Now, that's not censorship. Those are brands. That's Bud Light saying, I don't want my beer to be associated with this kind of content. And even if we go back not that long ago, brands that didn't want to be associated with things like the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which now is on Disney-owned property and very wholesome. So on one hand, there's brands choosing when they want to advertise and be associated with something or not. So they may take I'm not going to mention any cable news channels, but you can pick whichever one is your least favorite. And they may say, I want that audience, I want to reach adults 30 to 55. That's probably ambitious, probably a little older. But I don't want to be on the opinion shows. I just want to be on the news shows, or I only want to be on the documentary shows. And they're still shaping what they're funding on those channels. So I'm trying to edge into the topic that brands are already acting that way. Smart brands are already being selective with the context that they're putting their brand and their messages in, because it does all add up. Should they be swayed to just totally turn their ad budget off and turn off an entire channel? No. I mean, I guess the answer is it depends. But if it's something really dark, something really terrible, that's something that a brand just needs to figure out how to avoid and steer clear of. So I'm trying to think about it from many different angles.
But that's exactly the point. I mean, it's just like, there are some societal norms that I agree that we need to recognize. I mean, I'm not exactly in favor of the bans on the porn channels. I mean, I think that it's another way that a lot of, I won't get into the big argument over the porn channels, and it's just like, that's a whole other subject entirely.
It's a different episode, right?
Right. But the bigger issue of brands being caught in the crossfire of maybe, how can we say, extra woke people, overly woke people who are out there laying siege on any opinion that's counter to what they believe. And suddenly you have not moderation of dangerous content, you have censorship of content that is going counter to what we believe as a group of people. And, I agree that brands have the right to make that choice, but when they're strong-armed into that position, it's problematic. I mean, the threat of boycotting the brands if they don't boycott the publisher is is a very real one that a lot of brands are starting to have to wrestle with more and more. And the default position is, well, we'll turn it off until it blows over and then we'll come back on, which really is not a good move overall when it comes down to it. I mean, does anybody else have a problem with that, or am I the only one? I mean, Tamsen, what do you
there's none of us on this call are expert enough to know if this is even an answerable question, first of all. So, but let's still try. That's always fun. But what comes to mind for me is, my uncle is a psychologist, so maybe that tells you something. I don't know. Anyway, one of the things that he said, in the midst of, when I was first diagnosed with a panic disorder many years ago. I mean, I've been free of it now for a good 10 years, but one of the things that he said that always stuck with me is that the point of medication is to come off it. And what really sat with me about that, which is in the context, at least of the panic disorder, I was originally resistant to the medication. He said, hey, really taking the medication allows you to get to some kind of even state so that you can actually do the work that you need to do so that you don't have to be on the medication anymore. And so to me, I feel that there's the potential of something quite analogous in these kinds of situations, which is that there is utility in the kind of turning something off for a little while, but you can't do that without also, like back to my uncle, without simultaneously doing the work of trying to work on the underlying issues that are creating the things in the first place. And maybe that's rose-colored glasses and whatever, but I do think sometimes that there's enormous value in just putting a pause on things so that things can diffuse. You can start to, take the temperature. You can really start to figure out what's going on. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Are there people who are going to just freak the F out when you do that? Probably. And that's, to Adam's point, that's the point at which brands really need to decide who are they truly for, and decide whether or not, the loss of revenue in one area of their business is worth the cementing of revenue in another. But I just really think that there is some kind of value, Bob, just to give you a counterpoint to your position, that I think there is some value in creating a pause, but I don't think that that's a wise thing to do if it's rash, if it's not if it's not thoughtful, and if there's not also simultaneously the brand isn't doing work to try to rectify the situation, the underlying issues that prompted everything in the first place.
And Tamsen, great point, because I brought up UFC and I did not have this example fleshed out, but you just made the great point. When John McCain, the late senator from Arizona, called UFC human cockfighting, and all the brands pulled away from it. What UFC did in the background was they cleaned up the sport and they made it safer, moderately safer. So they did the work that was demanded by advertisers and sponsors so that the sport could live. It was near death at that point. What I wonder is if brands boycott a news channel, is anybody actually doing the work? I haven't seen evidence that it's really affected that. We had the Facebook boycott in the summertime, and you could see the chart go down of spending month over month, but year over year, it was still higher. And so I don't know that Facebook learned a lesson there, but that's not the fault of the advertisers who pulled back, is it?
So this is why UFC has no more roosters fighting each other, right?
This is one of the reasons.
Okay, I was checking. But, what I was thinking listening to you guys, and this is awesome for me because I feel like I'm actually a listener listening to these smart people talking. So I will now bring down the level of intellect. I'm just loving meta-national and pathetic fallacy. I love this. Seriously, I'm geeking out on this episode. And I'm having my own kind of out-of-body experience. But I was thinking, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. But this sword is a double-edged sword, and it's called monetization. And on the one side, you have advertising, and on the other side, you have subscription. And, I was thinking of Howard Stern, the man who has been, and the brand that has been completely liberated, no FTC issues anymore. and he's single-handedly put satellite radio, Sirius XM, on the map. But if there are three members of the Whack Pack. There was Wendy the retard, who is now known as Wendy the slow adult. There's Gary the retard, who's now known as Gary the conqueror. And then there was Eric the midget, who became known as Eric the actor. So there was a little bit of self-policing, or maybe self-awareness, happening even within this, bastion of what is considered to be, shock jock and extreme talk, etc. Some level of conforming to what is considered to be satisfactory, and ultimately, as we know, Howard Stern still has a boss, and there's still shareholders, and there's still advertisers. But I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be what we're witnessing, or maybe attempted to witness with Twitter v. Parler, with respect to, I found an article as I was doing some reading too, and it said, could Substack do for conservative writers what Patreon did for conservative podcasters? So that, I just started reading that, and there's always going to be a market, and there's always going to be an audience, and there's always going to be some kind of ability to monetize, but with scale, not dissimilar to the previous topic, comes certain growing pains and conformity, and and no one's ever going. Most people are never going to argue that in favor of censorship of any kind. However, we've been through just unprecedented times in this country, certainly over the last few weeks and months, where all the rules are being rewritten.
All these arguments make so much sense to me, and they, give a lot of clarity to the issue. But the one thing that still bothers me is, out of the examples I threw out there, Barry Weiss's example is most problematic for me, because she's a conservative, but she is by no means an ultra conservative. I mean, at most she's a moderate, and it's just like, she was hired by the Times, the New York Times, to be a counter voice in the publication, to review some more conservative leading books, to bring in op-ed pieces from a more conservative standpoint, to give the newspaper balance. And she was forced out of that publication because of her views. And her views are not radical in any shape of the imagination, nor did she support the president. So there's absolutely no excuse for it, except for the effort to bring about a certain amount of uniformity to the message, as opposed to any kind of counterpoint or any kind of counter belief. And I find that immensely troubling. And, as much as I've been on record as saying I'm glad the president is gone, the ex-president, the last president is gone. But it's just like, that doesn't mean that I have to dismiss all conservative standpoints from my view. I mean, there are some real considerations that need to be addressed, and I think that this is going to be problematic going forward.
Well, and there's also the fact that people who agree with, let's say, fringe voices or controversial voices continue to buy toothpaste, and continue to buy pillows, and continue to buy mattresses, and anytime I read about brands that are boycotting some of the programming on Fox News, for example, right? If you watch the Laura Ingraham show or something like that, you'll get lots of advertisers from, Buy Gold, or, the Bank of Mattress. We're only interested in,
right.
You'll get advertisers like that, right? But if you look at, the Nielsen ratings, a lot of those shows on Tucker Carlson and things like that are massively rated, especially before the election. Some of those Fox News programs just packed the top 20, like no joke. And so on the one hand, if you have brands boycotting, and you have some of these other brands, this is who we're left with. There's still, like, all of those people that watch those shows that are a market. And this reminds me in a way of back in the 90s, I consulted a radio station in Tokyo, and it was a giant radio station, had a weekly unique listeners average of 7 million humans a week, right? It's this giant, and they had sort of block programming, and it was mostly adult contemporary. And in the middle of the day, from like 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, they had a 2-hour block of opera music. And I got into working with the station, and that was sort of the first thing I was like, what in the hell are you doing with this 2-hour block of opera music? And they said, well, Shiseido pays for it. Okay, that's a big client. I get that, but you're torpedoing the sound of the station. Like the station it's like a complete train wreck every day at 2:00. And the head of the station handed me this big ream of paperwork and said, this is all the consumer research that Shiseido has done on women 30 to 54, who is the demographic of our station. And it says that people who love Shiseido cosmetics love opera. And they've done more research on these women than we have, so we're playing opera. And that's just not something you get on Fox News.
Right. Good point. Well, I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk next about the troubling news on the podcasting front, specifically the news coming out of Spotify. Reports are circulating this week that despite spending hundreds of millions of dollars on building out a podcasting empire, the company evidently continues to lose money on the investments. Tom, is this just the result of bad management, or is it revealing deeper problems with the podcasting monetization model? What do you say here, Mr. Podcasting Expert?
I'm so glad you gave me this one. And for those of you listening, and I know you are, at the start of the show before we go on the air, Bob always asks us if we have any conflicts of interest, right? And so I'm going to state right up front, I work with Spotify and I work with their podcasting team. And if I had any hesitation or any hedge on what I'm about to say, I would have said, Bob, I have a conflict of interest, but I don't. This article and a number of articles about this are based on a report that was put out by Citicorp, and their kind of wealth management financial services branch that are looking at some of these podcast, mostly content generating companies that Spotify has purchased. Those purchases were just last year. There were a couple in 2019 and a couple that were last year, and saying, look, it hasn't led, to a huge bump in subscribers or anything like that. And I just want to point out two things about reports like that. Number one, they are written by a financial services company that gets paid when you have transactions. And so they put out reports that tell you to do things like buy or sell. And this was a report that says sell, right? And the second thing I could tell you about reports like this is that they're written by children. They're written by people, they were, give me a memo on the Spotify acquisitions. Coming right up, sir. And you get someone who comes back and says, this hasn't paid off in a year.
Wait, Scott Monty's on this podcast? What's going on?
He is. Welcome, Scott Monty. So anyway, all of this is to say that if you look at the acquisitions that they made in 2019 and in 2020, as if they bought like a bauxite mine, and you're asking, all right, where are the Swiss watches being made? You got to give it a little bit of time. It's not like they bought a manufacturing plant, right? What they bought were a number of shops that have a demonstrated competence in creating fantastic audio content. And it turns out to be really, really difficult to create fantastic audio content, as the listeners of this show know.
Yes.
And what, and Spotify made some really tremendous acquisitions of that content. And it's incredibly short-term thinking to look at a balance book a year later and say, well, where is it? These were strategic acquisitions. These were acquisitions to diversify the content that's on Spotify, which Spotify was 100% music not too long ago. But our listening isn't 100% music. We listen to about 75% music. And so they were making some moves to address that other 25%. I think those acquisitions were fine acquisitions. And all of this is to say that it's a new field. It's not a field that folks writing investment reports necessarily have their head around. And it's fine to say that, this acquisition was too much money or that acquisition was too much money. But if you're Spotify, that's the price of entering this market. And they're now fully in this market. And they are fully a leader in this market. And that's the price of being a leader in this market.
Doesn't the criticism have a little bit of leg there, though? Because when they're talking about Anchor and specifics, when they specifically talk about Anchor, they're talking about a company that really wasn't making money before it was acquired and now is not making money now that it's acquired. So it seems like it's a problematic acquisition for them. Is that not the case?
Well, Anchor is a different dog, right? I mean, Anchor is a technology play, and if you're looking at,
but it's part of their portfolio of podcasting,
well,
acquisitions.
Anchor added a bunch of kind of producer tools to the Spotify toolkit, and I treat that as a different dog. That's not where the big money went for them, right? The big money that they spent was spent on content. It was spent on Gimlet. It was spent on The Ringer. It was spent on Joe Rogan. That's where the big money was spent. The Anchor acquisition was not a huge acquisition. And when you look at Spotify's global balance sheet, that Anchor acquisition is not very big. And so reading an investment report that all of these things have not paid off in 12 months or whatever, I think is really just a fundamental misunderstanding of what investing in content is all about. And it's really, as I said, it's really, really difficult to make great audio content. It's a rare skill. There aren't that many companies that have a demonstrated core competence in it beyond just this one brilliant person, right? And they've acquired some companies that do have that. It's not even a long-term play, but it sure as heck isn't a 12-month play.
Well, good.
Yeah, Tom, I think you touched on something. It's not a no, it's not working. It's just to me, it seems like a not yet. Those Gimlet and The Ringer that they've acquired will eventually find the audience. What I think Spotify is working on now is connecting the market to the content that they've been assembling and trying to increase people's habits over this past 6 months and next 12 months to get more people going to Spotify for podcast first, and aggregating an audience that has come from dozens of players in that space, different players, different apps, different websites. They'll all be collected at Spotify, one source for audio.
One of the other things that Tom and I were talking about before this, because we were actually talking about these topics earlier today, was that, particularly when it comes to the content piece of what they were, of the majority of these acquisitions from Spotify, is that essentially they are buying art, right? And if I know one thing about financial services and management consulting companies and things that issue these kinds of things, having worked for companies like this and in companies like that, is that they really don't understand art. And the thing is, you cannot judge art and the return on art by the same fundamental business only, money only standards that you can judge, an investment in a widget factory. They are not making widgets; they are making art. And that has so yes, of course there's a money component to it, but there's a much broader component to it that really does bring up a larger question that the financial world and the kind of buy-sell world has always struggled with, which is how do you quantify the value of something that is really in many ways beyond quantification. So to me, really, that's the fundamental issue, is that there is something beyond just the dollars and cents transaction of, did Spotify buy a good widget? Because it's really a much, much bigger question than that. And I think it's unfair to judge art by its immediate return.
But this isn't just about Spotify. I think that the article obviously was all about Spotify, but for me, the bigger question is, does this reveal some problems with the podcasting advertising model as a whole? Because, we bring up Gimlet and the Gimlet acquisition. Gimlet was subsidizing a lot of the revenue, not through advertising, but through creation of shows specifically for brands and for other companies out there that wanted to have shows produced. And, they're more of a production company model. And I'm wondering if that's where the money is for podcasting as opposed to the advertising model.
So, look, I totally agree with Tom when he set up the response based on the fact that, and then I think Adam said it as well, it's not a no, it's maybe a not yet. That said, I've been using Joe Rogan, amongst others, as my true north in terms of trying to build out my show and my platform and look to scale and monetize. And then I realized I went to podcasts on my iPhone to just look at, to just go back and look at Joe or listen to Joe's podcast. And what I realized is the last episode, at least on the feed that I'd been listening to, was in November. And then I was like, wait a second, what happened to his podcast? Where did it go? I know he did a deal with Spotify. Does it mean like it's not available anymore through Apple? And then I saw something called Joe Rogan Experience, which is now 3 and 4 hours, which is almost the best of the week. I mean, no one's going to listen to that for 4 hours. And then I realized, and I'm going to timestamp us at 46 odd minutes into the show for the first mention of, wait for it. What's the word? What's the word I'm about to say?
Cool.
Say it with me, people. Clubhouse.
Oh, Clubhouse.
And someone had to say it first, but there is just an abundance and an explosion of content right now. And I realized, wow, that's crazy that I didn't, by the way, just not for nothing, but I actually went to fill up with gas a week ago and found out my debit card expired in October. So, I swear, I'm not joking. And so I realized I don't go out much anymore. But still, the fact that I hadn't, even realized that Joe Rogan, the great Joe Rogan's podcast, is moved or changed or whatever, there's just a lot of competition. Tamsen's right. I mean, this is art. I view myself more as an artist than a business person in terms of being a host of a show. But it is it's tough out there. It's tough out there for creators. It's tough out there for publishers. It's tough out there for advertisers.
Well, but getting back to my question, though, I mean, it's just like,
Wait, there was a question?
There was a question. There was a question in there, which is basically...
It's hard to make great audio content.
No, but basically this whole idea that advertising is in the crosshairs in terms of podcasting, that I think that's a legitimate concern, that, we're judging whether or not these podcast acquisitions are good and effective based on advertising revenue, which seems to be the only metric for success in the space. When, you have the example of Gimlet, which was more of a production house and was making money through production consulting. I don't know if they're still doing that. I don't know if they're still in that operation. Maybe you can clarify a little bit, Tom, but it seems to me like that's becoming more and more the source of revenue is the creation of podcasts as opposed to the actual advertising on podcasts.
I would submit that Spotify has not even begun to tap advertising. And they have miles and miles to go there. That's all potential. Let us not forget that Spotify is easily the most effective audio company at converting free subscribers into premium subscribers. The ratio of premium subscribers to free is the envy of the audio world. And this is all a part of that. And if you look at, there's no one way to make money from podcasting. There are multiple ways to make money from podcasting.
Yeah.
And Spotify has, arguably the most enviable position in sort of direct supported content. And they haven't even begun to tap advertising. And, I agree with what Tamsen said 100%. It's really hard to value art. And I think Citibank, in issuing this, is not extending Spotify the same kind of benefit of the doubt that they would, Amazon or Netflix or anybody else making a significant investment in content with the hope of it paying off as a platform years down the road. It's just way too soon. And I think they have assembled a pretty enviable collection of parts to get there, and they haven't even begun to tap advertising.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, what was that stat about podcasting versus Twitter and the advertisement? I mean, there was Edison came up with like bananas stat about podcasting versus Twitter as far as, was it reach?
Well, yeah, I mean, so more than twice as many people listen to a podcast every month as use Twitter every month. And yet agencies have giant budgets for Twitter. And podcasting punches way under its weight compared to things like AM/FM radio, right? I mean, podcasting right now is about 1/7 of AM/FM broadcast radio in terms of listening time, but it's a lot less than that in terms of share of the $18+ billion audio industry. So sky's the limit on advertising. It is, podcasting as an advertising supported medium is frankly just getting started.
I personally like to see Tom and Tamsen arguing and disagreeing more personally. But
Here.
but in this case, they make the perfect couple and the perfect team. And I think, for anyone that has any doubt, they shouldn't, because great advertising and messaging, the cream always should rise to the top, provided it isn't suffocated by too much quantity, too much advertising. So quality will win over quantity in terms of number of messaging units or paid placements, and also the creativity. But the thing that Tom said, really, that I think people should emphasize that point a billion times, is there are multiple ways to monetize, and there are multiple ways to make money. And there's smart players out there, and certainly we're not just talking about Spotify, we're talking about podcasting monetization, but Spotify certainly is one of them. It's figured out multiple ways to monetize. And that is quite encouraging, because remember, in addition to subscription, in addition to various freemium types of scaled models and advertising and live reads, there also is Patreon. And I'm personally most excited by those kinds of models that allow different levels and tiers of access to fans and communities. So I think our best days when it comes to the space are ahead of us.
Well, that's good news, and I always find it weird and meta to talk about podcasting on a podcast. It's such a weird thing to go through, especially since I accept advertising. But I thought it was an important conversation and one worth having. Look, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to get to this last topic real quick. We've heard it said that agencies need to have a strong culture and should hire to fit that culture. The problem is hiring to your culture often blocks diversity and inclusiveness at these same agencies. So, Joe, how do you build and maintain a strong culture while still diversifying your hiring practices? I mean, what would be your advice to companies out there struggling with this?
Well, there only are a few minutes left, so we'll make this quick. I mean, the problem with agency culture is there isn't, or the culture is toxic. So, I mean, this is a downward death spiral, so to speak. And I mean, if hiring to your culture blocks diversity and inclusiveness, you have a real culture problem, period. So, I mean, it's, your question is, how do you build and maintain a strong culture while still diversifying your hiring practices? You build and maintain a strong culture by diversifying your hiring practices. The end.
Yeah, I have experience with this, having, done some work with agencies in the past, and, the whole push for cultural fit and making sure you're around to be part of the culture. And I'm like looking around me going, I understand. I grew up in the suburbs with a whole bunch of white people. I know exactly what your culture is like, It's an ongoing problem that agencies continue to, kind of coddle their culture and say that it's the thing that defines them. But unfortunately, it defines them badly. Would anyone disagree? I mean...
Oh, hell no. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I say that?
Yeah, please.
I mean, the thing, it is always stunning to me, because I worked in one, agencies that are like, well, what differentiates us is our culture. I'm like, well, if everybody says that, no, it doesn't. And also, how does your culture turn up in my advertising? Don't think it really directly relates. But anyway, the thing is that a lot of times when people, and companies in particular, what I've observed is that much like brands, when they're like, this is our brand, they establish their culture in a very aspirational way. They say, this is what we wish our culture is. And they don't actually take the time to do the work and figure out what are actually the kind of true basic values and assumptions that are driving that culture in the first place. And that, if they were to do that kind of work, that's kind of, though it's that underlying stuff that's oftentimes, I think, driving the kind of very narrow definition of the people that will fit, and therefore kind of, fulfilling the bubble. I mean, I think one of the themes of what we've been talking about tonight is that generally, one of my mantras is distrust anyone that doesn't distrust themselves. And I think that's particularly accurate when you're thinking about like, well, our culture is awesome. Like, what is it? And if you don't question it, then I think you need to worry about it. Because if you're not constantly wondering, are we doing well enough? Are we Are we representing enough? Are we consonant enough? Do we have enough integrity to what we say our values are? Then you're not doing that work, and you're really opening yourself up for really, I think, dangerous choices, particularly in hiring. And eventually those do make it out, those kinds of things make it out to what you put in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the last topic, it's all about revenue ultimately. And small agency owners are working against razor thin margins. They're working against such market pressure. So few of them can afford to think about culture without thinking about it as, how is this going to make me more money? That's part of what they need to do, is figure out how to prioritize the culture and prioritize diversification of who they're hiring in it to really improve and actually have a culture versus a list of values on the wall, and figure out how to add that in and factor in how that's contributing to the overall business and the health of it.
And with that, it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Joseph Jaffe. You can find him at coronatv.show. That's the home of Corona TV. And you can find that on YouTube, on Facebook, all over the place. But tell us what's going on in your world, Joe. What would you like to promote?
Besides Corona TV, and Corona TV in that order, I am head down and focused on building out the show. I still fondly think back to Tamsen's incredible appearance on the show. What was that? The paradox, the something paradox you said. I'll remember it. I'll go check it out. I still cite that. One of the smartest things I've heard. That was until
the marketer's paradox, right? That we do, when oftentimes in marketers, this is my own invention. The marketer's paradox is that we do unto others that which we would never be successful on ourselves.
It was the most intelligent thing until I heard about the pathetic fallacy, which is now my new favorite.
Is it pathetic or is it pathetic with a B as in boy, Tom?
It is pathetic, literally fake feeling.
Nice.
I'm personally a big fan of Big Google energy, so I'm just going to go with that.
I think Tamsen named the show, frankly.
Wait, this is my plug. Fallacy with an F, not a PH. Okay. So I just wanted to say that I'm excited about some guests coming up this week. I have Daniel Golden, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote a book called The Price of Admission. I have Lauren Griffiths, who is just a normal person like us, except that she changed her biopic on LinkedIn from this retouched, airbrushed, corporate formal photo to her without makeup on, without doing her hair in sweats, because that was reflective of who she is. And she's just under 1 million likes and 30,000 comments. And it obviously hit a nerve with so many people, particularly, I think, women. And we're going to talk about that. And then I also have Tom Peters coming up and Dr. Robin D'Angelo, who wrote White Fragility. So I'm really excited about the flexibility and the diversity of guests, from very well-known people to people that no one would have heard of, but ultimately everyone has a story to tell. So I'm just going to keep on plugging along.
And it's fantastic. I mean, it's just like really, really, truly some great work. So check it out at coronatv.show. As for the next guest, Adam Pierno, you can find him at adampierno.com. That's where you can get information about his books and his life and everything else that's going on in the world of Adam. But tell us, and of course he's at ASU, which is Arizona State University at asu.edu. But tell us what's going on in your world, Adam. What would you like to promote?
You hit the high notes there, Bob. Thank you so much. I have 2 books. Underthink It is a handbook for strategy inside agencies, where unfortunately not enough attention goes to training. And my second book is called Specific, and that is a look at how media has changed the world to make it harder for brands to start from scratch, because we're full. We don't want any more brands. So you can check both of those out at adampierno.com. Thanks.
Fantastic. And I've read Specific, some good stuff, some good advice. So definitely check that book out. Next up, we have Tamsen Webster. You can find her at tamsenwebster.com. That's the home of her consultancy, and where you can book her to be a keynoter. Of course, not actually keynoting, but actually on a computer like the rest of us, but
virtual keynotes,
but consulting and all kinds of work,
yes.
all kinds of work. So tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote, Tamsen?
Well, I'd like to promote Corona TV. And I'm actually serious about that because it's a great show. And I particularly love what Joe does afterwards with his Zoom room, where there's really kind of a conversation with the people who have just watched it. So I'm going to promote that. I do, however, I finally have a book coming out, and that's going to be coming out in May. And that's called Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. So if people want to know more about that as new things come available, like pre-order offers and things like that, they can sign up to be alerted at redthreadbook.com.
That's exciting news, and definitely, I'm sure a lot of people out there would want to buy a book from Tamsen Webster, Tamsen Webster.
It's kind
Tamsen,
of my yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
You have to book to come back in May, and I also, after that, those very kind words, I need your Venmo account, please.
Fabulous. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about it. I'm actually, I think even though I've read it like 20 million times in all my editing of it, it really does, I think, capture. My goal was to give you a Tamsen in your pocket, like give you my step-by-step method for making things make sense and how to talk about your big idea and why it's important. And I'm excited to see what people think.
Yeah, very exciting. Very exciting. Thank you for sharing that. Last but not least, we have Tom Webster. You can find him at edisonresearch.com. That's the home of the company where he is the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Strategy. Tell us what's going on in your world, Tom. What would you like to promote?
Well, we've got a couple things coming up. So my company, Edison, besides podcasting, which thanks for mentioning all that, Bob, we're the sole providers of exit polling and vote count data for the major news networks that are part of the national election pool. So if you watched television on election night, and I'm guessing somewhere between 10 and 15% of you did. You saw our data, and we're doing a webinar this Thursday on kind of what we learned from doing all of that on election night. It was a pretty successful night for us. We've been doing the exit polling work for the network since 2003. So this was just, it was interesting doing it in a time of pandemic. So that's coming up this Thursday. And then the second thing in March 11th, is the 24th year of our Infinite Dial study, which is really the survey of record in the audio industry. It's where a lot of the currency data on podcasting and streaming audio and smart speakers and things like that come out. Started in 1998. Where the 2021 edition comes out March 11th. I was just a boy when it started, but I'm very happy to be part of that again. And
well, they were lucky to have you when you were such a young boy. So
I was such a small child, very impressionable.
I think you sounded like that guy from the financial services company.
You mean this guy?
Yeah, that one.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, definitely check those surveys out. The Edison Research content is just wonderful and definitely should be looked at, and you should work with them if you get a chance. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. And of course, you can even find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. First up, Adam, Netflix Korea got a Guinness Book World Record for the tiniest ad ever, and they ran it in Variety. It was for a show called Busted. I thought this was interesting. In some ways, it wasn't a tiny ad because they still bought the huge ad space and just put a tiny little graphic in the ad space. So, I mean, okay, you can get critical of it, but it was still eye-popping how small this was. You're just struggling to read it, but it was so compelling for me. What do you think about this ad?
Oh, well, size matters clearly, but also so does relevance. And because I think what's so cool is that this was an ad for a show that was about kind of hunting for clues. So I love the fact that it was something very, very small that you kind of had to notice, had to explore, and all of that. So I just love that combination.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Absolutely good stuff. Now, for the fail of the week, I'm going to give it to Costco. when every other retailer out there, and I'm loath to say this considering the earlier topic about censorship, but Costco has decided to sell MyPillow when every other retail brand out there is getting rid of the brand over the fact that the owner of the company has been advocating for the overturn of the election and is part of the many crime-ridden scoundrels out there who are saying that the attack on the Capitol was worth it, was something that was good and had to be done. So I'm not sure, Joe, where you stand on all this, but Costco taking up MyPillow seems to be a misstep for them, considering the things that the brand is involved with at the current time.
I mean, obviously, my gut is to pile on the pain and pile on the hurt, but then also to be mindful of the conversation, as you said, that we had. But at the end of the day, like I gotta say, let consumers vote with their with their hard-earned money, and if they want to boycott the pillow, let them boycott the pillow. And sadly, not sadly, just I'm sure there are going to be. We know that there are at least 74 million, potentially 74 million consumers in this country that might want to put one of those pillows, I don't know why, and underneath their heads at night. And the good news is that Costco also sells coffins. So maybe they can, like, I don't know, do a daily double and you get a pillow and a coffin together. I don't know.
Jeez.
And speaking of the foul,
it's paradoxical marketing.
And speaking of fouls, we'll get to the foul. DDB is being sued by Hero Group, another smaller agency, over failure to compensate in winning of the Army account. Apparently, Hero gave all this consulting work to DDB and then didn't get any kind of compensation or any work as a result of the win of the Army account. Now, this, I'm not sure what you think about it, Tom, but for me, this sounds like Hero has a bad contract. Yes, DDB should probably be more forthcoming with work to a partner that helped them win the account. But at the same time, if you don't have a contract that says you're going to get the work, you're just being stupid.
Well, I think it's also important to remember, and Hero Group really should have done their research, DDB is a holding company, right? If you wanted to do work and get paid, you should work with a giving you things company. But a holding company is a company that holds things.
Okay, that's as bad a dad joke as I'm going to get today, so I'm going to have to go with it. Have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it, comment online, use the hashtag #FairFailFoul. That's #FairFailFoul. And that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Cool beans.